Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Dwayne Johnson makes a dramatic comeback of his own in The Smashing Machine. Set between 1997 and 2000, Mark the Smashing Machine Kerr, played by Dwayne Johnson, is an undefeated force in MMA at a time where the sport was controversial in the US, and Kerr fights in the Pride events in Japan. But when Kerr suffers a series of personal and professional defeats, like his opioid addiction that strains his relationship with his girlfriend Dawn Staples, played by Emily Blunt, Kerr's toughest fight will be to make a comeback and find his own happiness. The Smashing Machine is largely inspired by John Himes' 2002 HBO documentary of the same name, which followed Kerr's ups and downs and those around him, which was highly acclaimed at the time. I actually tracked it down and watched it for this review, and if you have seen the film, it's well worth watching because it serves as a good companion piece to see the real-life counterparts, and it's a very candid, warts and all doc. It's also worth seeing just for the sake of comparison, because Safdie takes a lot from it, effectively recreating entire scenes down to the exact dialogue and even camera framing in some instances, and some scenes are either inspired or transposed from it. Even the narrative film's structure is similar to the non-fiction one in the way the events are structured, particularly near the end of the film and the cross-cutting between the fighting and Kerr being stitched up. That's copying an editing choice from the documentary. This is Benny Safdie's first solo directing outing, having previously worked with his brother Josh on movies like Good Time or the incredibly intense Uncut Gems. Like the Coens currently, they've split to work on different projects, both of which are A24 sports films. Josh is writing and directing the fictional ping-pong drama Marty Supreme with Timothée Chalamet, which is out at Christmas. Benny is also a writer and director on The Smashing Machine, which tries hard to maintain the grit and feel of the documentary that inspired it, with lots of handheld camera work and tight crash zooms. One thing that does set apart from the doc is that it was shot on early digital video, whereas a lot of the narrative film is shot on 16mm film that gives us this rough texture, itself synonymous with low-budget documentaries, that expands into 70mm film in the big arena sequences. There's also a couple of sequences that are shot on VHS cameras, particularly the opening credits, which really gives you that 90s feel. It's clear that authenticity was a big aim on Safdie's part with the direction, right down to getting very precise details like shirts, hats and clothes that people wear, which are emulated often directly from the original documentary. It immerses you in this world of early MMA in America, and that authenticity was clearly a major reason for the casting of Johnson in the lead role. And the central attraction of the movie is Dwayne Johnson and his radical transformation. Johnson's had a career that's gone through a lot of different phases. When he started out, he was seen as the heir to Arnie's crown, and he was put in some fairly fun action vehicles, but as a wrestler-turned actor, the only major ones that had come before him were Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan, and Piper's film career didn't really take off, and Hogan's filmography is a punchline. There was a time when Hollywood just didn't know what to do with Johnson, and he very nearly went down a Hogan-like path of embarrassing family films that he thankfully broke out of. But it was at that time where you also did see him try to get out of his comfort zone and experiment. That was when he got his twitchy, insecure role in the bonkers Southland Tales. His gay bodyguard was the only good bit of Be Cool, and then a few years later he did Snitch and was terrific in Michael Bay's Pain and Gain. A lot of those films weren't very good, but for those that were paying attention, they show that Johnson had the chops of a kind that don't elicit a woo! But those kind of roles disappeared when his career was catapulted by Fast and Furious, and Johnson became focused on being a movie star. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of A-listers that I would consider to be movie stars, where their presence and personality is the attraction, and someone as muscular and charismatic as The Rock naturally fitted into that role, especially as you don't expect someone like that to disappear. He had finally become the Arnold he had aspired to be. I remember there was a Rolling Stone profile in 2018 where Johnson talked about wanting to make crowd-pleasing movies, quote, never send an audience home unhappy, that he didn't want to do darker roles. Quote, no one is going to see me play a borderline psychopath suffering from depression. how times change. However, Johnson has not always chosen wisely. Some vehicles, like Jumanji, have fit him very well, but often he's leading these overblown, interchangeable, CG-heavy action films where even he felt the same from film to film. And worse, he kept picking this humorless, toughest guy in the universe parts that don't play to his charm or strength. Everything about Johnson felt safe, brand managed, and packaged, but when you're a movie star, your brand is only as good as the films you star in, and a lot of them just weren't very good. And other wrestlers who followed in Johnson's footsteps, like John Cena or Dave Bautista, not just caught up with him, but overtook him as actors. People looked at Bautista, who mixes action roles with character work, and asked why Johnson wasn't doing the same. You combine that with the fact that Johnson had some very public dents in his image, from the bust up with Vin Diesel to trying to hijack DC through Black Adam, or the infamous bottles of pee reports from the set of Red 1, and it's clear that Johnson needed a reinvention. The Smashing Machine marks the start of that. Johnson has already committed to working with Benny Safdie on his next film, and he's talking about working with Scorsese. Johnson clearly wants to be taken seriously as an actor. He commits to this film like a man who has something to prove, not just to silence his critics, but also to challenge himself. It's a risk for sure, but it's a calculated risk. Johnson comes from a very similar background to the man he's playing, and Kerr did come from a wrestling background before he moved into MMA, and the two are very closely intertwined. And don't think it didn't escape my notice that both WWE and UFC are now owned by TKO, and the film could kind of be a cross-promotion given that Kerr is an inducted UFC Hall of Famer. There's only a 4-year difference between Johnson and Kerr now, so you could argue that Johnson is a bit too old to play him 2 decades ago, but going back to that authenticity, only someone like Johnson knows what it's like to live through that kind of physicality and the toll it takes upon you. That's what Johnson brings to the film, a kind of lived-in, behind-the-curtain glimpse of being in the show business of fighting. It might seem unimaginable with someone of the physique of Johnson to somehow disappear, but there are times in the Smash Machine where he does genuinely vanish into Kerr. Thanks to the combination of prosthetics and adopting Kerr's mannerisms and softly spoken voice, it is possible to see the role and not the actor, although when Kerr shaves his head near the end, you do start to see Johnson again somewhat unavoidably. But I think Johnson was drawn to the role because he sees a lot of himself in Kerr and relates to his story of coming back after falling down to earth, and there are moments where Kerr and Johnson intertwine so closely that it blurs where one starts and the other begins. There's a scene where Kerr apologises to supporters at a press conference for not being, quote, the man you thought I was, and it almost feels like Johnson apologising to his own fans. Kerr made his entire life about winning. He starts the film undefeated and talks about chasing that high of the crowd cheering after he wins a bout. At the start he says that he can't let his emotions be like a spotlight, that he has to be laser focused on victory. Everything he does is to that aim, even if he has to emotionally detach himself. When he's asked, what if he loses? He says he can't think like that. And the possibility seems to baffle and unsettle him. He's setting himself up for a big fall. When he inevitably fails, it absolutely destroys him. It isn't just that he can't handle it, but the reality of the situation is utterly incomprehensible to him. There's a great wonder as he walks out of the ring and into the backstage area, barely able to hide his anger, and the camera keeps following him as he meets with the Pride officials as he tries to make excuses and rationalise that it wasn't his fault. The subsequent journey to the locker room, where the impact of what just happened finally hits, is some of Johnson's best work. And for someone who has spent so long trying to make himself an indestructible force both on screen and off, the Smashing Machine makes Johnson something that he hasn't been for a long time. Vulnerable. Underneath that enormously muscular body is insecurity and a fragile, wounded masculinity. And once winning is taken away, everything starts to fall apart because he's used it as a way of avoiding facing his problems. That is especially true of his addiction to opioids and prescription painkillers and how dangerously reliant and addicted he's become. He's constantly in doctor's offices trying to talk his way into getting stronger and stronger medication, and the constant pain his body is in, his denial about how serious and life-threatening his issues have become. The scene in the hospital where he again tries to downplay what happened before finally breaking into tears at just how close he came to death and how scared he is. That is a phenomenal bit of acting by Johnson in a way I've never seen him do before. But for those expecting this to be a drama about addiction, this is more a movie about recovery, again like the documentary. Safdie has said that Rocky 3 was something of an inspiration, and while this is a very different film, you can sort of see it. It's Kerr asking himself, without the adulation and the drugs, who am I? He has to redefine what's a victory, whether it's keeping himself clean or his own personal fulfillment. Those are the battles worth winning and learning from defeat and pain, and Johnson embraces that in every sense. And the tough but tender tone runs through the Smashing Machine even through the fights. The combat is brutal and sharp, emphasised by the sound design of bodies hitting up against each other, the sounds of canvas, and a roaring crowd. The punches aren't big cartoon sound effects, they're meaty, realistic thuds. Running through the background is the birth of MMA into the sport we know it now, and the changes gradually being implemented, namely the moves being banned like eye gouges and headbutts, all things we see Kerr using to win bouts at the very start. It's worth noting at this time that MMA in the US was sold as a blood sport and was very close to being banned. This is only partially mentioned in the narrative film, but it's more present in the doc. And Kerr is ferocious in the ring. He didn't earn his nickname lightly, but as soon as the fight is over, he's immediately checking on the condition of his opponent. There's a strange contradiction between Kerr before and after the bell rings that speaks to the camaraderie between the fighters, and Kerr has an especially strong friendship with Mark Coleman, a key role played by MMA fighter Ryan Bader, making his acting debut, who does surprisingly well considering. Coleman is just that little bit older than Kerr, and he's trying to make a comeback of his own that mirrors Kerr's. Bader is one of several real-life fighters throughout the sporting cast that add to the authenticity of the movie. Yep, it's that word again, including Kerr's trainer Baz Rutten playing himself. One thing that did distract me during the bouts is the commentators, who are prone to eye-rolling psychoanalysis and spelling out obvious dramatic states in a way where somehow the punches aren't the most heavy-handed thing going on. But the biggest fights in the movie happen outside the ring, in the relationship between Kerr and his then-girlfriend Dawn Staples, which to describe as dysfunctional would be an understatement. They argue, they make up, and love each other over and over again. Kerr doesn't treat her very well at times, especially in the lead up to bouts where his laser focus is pushing her away and ignoring her, but Staples can also antagonise and provoke him, and it can get straight up abusive between them as they really try to hurt each other emotionally. There's an added element for the narrative film that Kerr buys an expensive Japanese bowl for her, which symbolises their relationship. No prizes for guessing what happens to that when their arguments usually result in nearby objects getting destroyed. There's several points where Kerr punches through doors like they were tissue paper. Re-teamed with her Jungle Cruise co-star and friend, Emily Blunt is a fine actor, but I think she gets a bit lost in this movie, but I don't think that's her fault, really. I watched the new film first, and I found Dawn's behaviour to be somewhat inexplicable. I didn't really understand why sometimes she would be supportive, and then at other times be really insensitive to Kerr's recovery and her own drinking. It was only after I watched the documentary did I finally get a sense of her, in part because she admits directly to the camera she was jealous of his fighting because he would put it over her, or that she worried he no longer needed her after he got clean because she was enabling him. And I know in a drama you can't say that explicitly, but it needs to be implicit. But it speaks to a failing of the film that doesn't really communicate that coherently. And these scenes between Mark and Dawn are the most conjecture and invention. It's where Safdie's inexperience as a writer, given he's never written his own film before, most shows. You get these huge, arguing, screaming matches, but nowhere near enough of the love about what keeps these people somehow together. It shows the weakness in Safdie's writing, in that once he isn't using the documentary, he's much less sure-footed and doesn't seem to know what these scenes are saying. That's especially true near the end, where their fighting escalates to a point where things really get out of hand and the police have to be called. But the film ends with a closing text saying they married shortly after, which is likely to leave viewers baffled that that is the last time that we see them together. That's copying how events played out in the documentary, but that doesn't really work here for two reasons. First, Dawn wasn't as prominent in the doc as she is here. Second, this is a narrative feature, so you expect to have some resolution, at least if this is meant to be a love story, albeit a kind of toxic one. There needed to be a scene where they heal or forgive each other at the end of it. Instead, their arc feels somehow incomplete, and it underserves Blunt. The Smashing Machine shows that Dwayne Johnson is capable of far more than some have given him credit for, and he's genuinely great in this. The film itself, though, is good, not great. Its biggest issue is that it's far too reliant on the documentary that inspired it, and yes, that does give it a lot of accuracy and specific detail to the world it inhabits, but those who are already familiar with it may be disappointed that this is effectively a remake, and when it deviates away from it with new or inventive material, the film is much less assured, and I don't think Safdie adds enough of his own perspective on the material, especially in the writing. He uses the documentary like a guardrail. It's a strong enough story that it still largely works, but the opportunity to truly expand on the doc has been missed. I'd say watch them both. See this for Johnson's performance, but then see the documentary for the real story, which it told first. If you're an MMA fan, I suspect the latter is the one you'll want to revisit more often. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can help keep me in fighting shape over on my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share, and hype the video. It all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.